Good evening, everyone. Hi. Welcome to the Explorers Club Monday night lecture, which is Exposing the World's Environmental Criminals. And thank you for making this trek on a wintry, rainy / warm, Monday, December. How many people have been here for the first time today? Okay, amazing. Thank you for coming. Welcome. I'm sure the polar bear made quite an impression. So this building is home to artifacts from explorers and their expeditions and their incredible stories. They are in many ways a reflection of the founding principles of the Explorers Club, which is to promote scientific exploration, field research, and encourage a spirit of exploration. My name is Emily Driscoll, and I'm a science video producer, and I've been a fellow at the Explorers Club since 2014. And I should add, this Monday night lecture series has been going on since the 1920s. Yeah. So exploration is about following your curiosity into undiscovered places. And these explorations almost always involve investigating what was discovered. Exploration and investigation are two sides of the same coin, both driven by curiosity and a desire to uncover the truth. Explorers and investigative reporters venture into uncharted territory, risk their safety, seek to uncover hidden truths, and share their knowledge. Our speaker today embodies the essence of exploration and investigative reporting. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker, Rene Ebersole. Rene's investigative reporting has taken her around the world and shaped public discourse on complex environmental issues, including the world's bushmeat trade, attempts to save the northern white rhino, and tracking the illegal cheetah trade, among many others. Her reports have had material impact, including leading to the arrests of wildlife traffickers. I think that deserves a round of applause. Rene's reporting has garnered widespread recognition, including the prestigious National Magazine Award, and her articles and cover stories have appeared in major publications like Rolling Stone, National Geographic, Audubon Magazine, and the Washington Post. But an explorer's work is never finished, and Rene did not stop there. She co-founded a nonprofit, Wildlife Reporters and Editors, or WIRE, to support other investigative reporting focused on the wildlife trade. This is at a time when investigative reporting budgets are slashed or eliminated altogether. Through WIRE, Rene and her collaborators are building an ecosystem where critical stories are researched, reported, and shared to expose the world's wildlife criminals and stop the illegal wildlife trade. So please join me in welcoming Rene Ebersole.
Thank you, Emily. I'm climbing up on a box here because I'm short. Such a pleasure to be here tonight. Thank you, everyone, for coming out on a rainy New York night. And it's so nice and cozy in here, isn't it? Like they've got it all decked out for the holidays. It just feels really warm, and it's lovely to see all of you. And it's just such an honor to be here at the Explorers Club. I've sat in these seats many times listening to speakers. And so it's just sort of surreal to be up here at the podium. This goes very much along with what Emily was saying. One member giving a talk here not that long ago posed the question, what's the difference between travel and exploration? I don't know about you, but when I think of travel, I think about like moving around from destination to destination, taking in the sights, but exploration is a little bit different, right? Exploration is when you're traveling with a purpose. And I'm here to tell you that journalists are explorers, because journalism is the pursuit of knowledge that is in the public interest. you. So my name's Rene Ebersole. I'm a journalist and also the editor-in-chief of Wildlife Investigative Reporters and Editors, WIRE. Tonight I'm going to tell you about the illegal wildlife trade, and I first have to thank the photographers who've contributed to my talk. Most of them I've worked with on assignments with National Geographic. Some of them I hope to work with soon, and they've all been really generous sharing their photographs. The illegal wildlife trade is a serious threat to nature. It's a $23 billion business on par with drugs, arms, and human smuggling. And often it's the very same crime syndicates involved with all of these things. Wildlife crime accelerates extinction by targeting animals and plants, particularly those already vulnerable to climate change and habitat loss. Iconic species like elephants, rhinos, and pangolins are among the most affected. Poaching for the ivory trade is one of the main threats to elephants. Since 1980, the number of elephants in Africa has fallen from 1.3 million to 415,000. The ivory trade leaves behind elephant calves and deeply affecting their survival. This is a calf that was rescued in Kenya. And wildlife rescues and sanctuaries can help calves like these, but the emotional trauma and the cultural knowledge that's within the herds can be, the lost cultural knowledge can be long-lasting. That's a disturbing photo, right? I promise there will be some happy pictures in here. The illegal trade of rhino horns, driven by the demand of traditional medicine and luxury items, is pushing wild rhino populations to the brink of extinction. Poachers kill rhinos for their horns, which are made from keratin. It's the same material that's in our fingernails. And the horn hacked off of this critically endangered black rhino in South Africa was likely smuggled to Asia for traditional medicine or carvings. This trade disrupts ecosystems where rhinos are key grazers and devastates local communities reliant on ecosystems. Conservation efforts include anti-poaching patrols, dehorning programs, and international campaigns to reduce demand and enforce trade bans. Pangolins. How many people here have heard of a pangolin? Yeah, okay, good. They're the most trafficked mammal globally. The illegal trade is driven for the demand for their scales. You can see they kind of remind you of like an artichoke a little bit on the outside. And those scales are used in traditional medicine, and their meat is also considered a luxury in some regions. The trade is devastating pangolin populations, pushing all 8 species toward extinction. This one is clinging to its caretaker at a rescue center in Zimbabwe. Authorities have seized animals representing more than 6,000 species, everything from ants, I'm serious, to zebras. They bring the ants in like little straws. They smuggle them in, if they're a new species or an exotic species that they'd like to have in their collection. And this is a worrisome trend, all these species being brought in, because we're currently facing a biodiversity crisis. Wildlife populations have declined by 70% in the last 50 years due to habitat loss, climate change, and overhunting. My career in journalism didn't start traditionally. I never worked on my school newspaper or got an English degree. I started in science doing a self-recognition study with great apes at a time when people still believed that humans were the only creatures with self-awareness. These studies involve showing a mirror to the ape or to the animal to see if they use it as a tool or if they think it's another animal they're looking at. And you can see in this picture that the chimpanzee is using it as a tool to check out his eye. The orangutan that I worked with, his name was Ray, he also used the mirror as a tool to look at his eye. He also checked out his teeth. He hung upside down. He looked at his genitals. He was really interested in it. And it was a fabulous experience just learning and seeing how knowledgeable and aware these creatures are. And of course now we know that many other animals are self-aware too. Oops, sorry. Instead of pursuing a career in science, I wound up getting a master's degree at New York University's Science, Health, and Environmental Reporting program, the same program that Emily attended, actually. I wanted to write stories that would not only educate the public about the threats to wildlife, but also have a positive impact. With my degree, I started interning and working at various publications, including Audubon, Wildlife Conservation magazine, which at the time was published by the Wildlife Conservation Society based at the Bronx Zoo, Weekly Reader's Classroom magazine, Current Science. Does anyone remember Weekly Reader? Oh, there's one hand in the back. Okay. 2 hands. Yeah, so Weekly Reader used to be produced for classrooms all over the world, and it was purchased by Scholastic. Probably more of you know Scholastic. So it's been published by Scholastic for a while. And I also worked for National Wildlife magazine as an editor on their staff. My first big international assignment took me to Belize to write about a big cat biologist named Alan Rabinowitz. He was known as the Indiana Jones of wildlife conservation, and he established the Jaguar Corridor Initiative, connecting jaguar habitat from Mexico to Argentina, and the world's first jaguar sanctuary. He also worked to stop jaguar poaching. Oops. In the years that followed, I worked as a full-time editor and freelance for a wide variety of publications, including Outside Magazine, Popular Science, Scientific American, The Nation, and even Cooking Light. Pretty much anyone who will hire me. In 2005, I became an editor at Audubon magazine, the flagship publication of the National Audubon Society. Audubon features in-depth articles about conservation, habitat preservation, and environmental science, as well as stunning photography and artwork that celebrate the nature's beauty. And I'm happy to say the photo editor is here tonight. Sabine, raise your hand. While I dabbled in a few stories about wildlife crime over the years, my first major gateway to the strange underground world came in 2015, when I read a government press release about the indictment of a man who had been caught smuggling songbirds on a flight from Cuba to Miami. I soon found there was an entire network of people who come and go from Cuba, smuggling birds in their clothes, strapped to their legs, or very commonly in their underwear, according to Florida State Attorney Tom Watts Fitzgerald, who was prosecuting some of the cases. The problem was so widespread, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service agents launched a special investigation called Operation Ornery Birds to catch criminals illegally buying and selling and bartering protected songbirds prized for their colorful plumage and their singing abilities. They wanted to call the investigation Operation Angry Birds, but there were some concerns about copyright, so they went with Ornery Birds. This investigation was one of the biggest efforts in U.S. history to expose the multi-million-dollar underground market for songbirds. Keeping caged birds is a cultural tradition in Cuba and also many other regions of the world. Favored species such as the Cuban bullfinch are displayed in streets and in homes. They're also used in singing contests where prized male birds are placed near each other, spurring them to sing. They're defending their territory. And these competitions have migrated to many cities, including New York City and Miami. And in Miami, there was an illegal songbird trade that became a lucrative black market activity that threatened bird populations, particularly those valued for their plumage and their songs. Cuban bullfinches and other birds smuggled into the country, they were smuggled into the country using a variety of methods. And here you can see these are prescription bottles with holes drilled into them so that the birds could breathe. Obviously, these are not ideal conditions to travel in, and many of the birds don't make it. They also use hair curlers. They hide them under their clothes. They pack them by the dozens in false bottom suitcases and in boxes. Native bird species like the indigo bunting, northern cardinal, and painted buntings are also highly sought after and often sold for exorbitant prices on the underground market. Traffickers typically use baited traps to capture these birds and transport them under inhumane conditions, often leading to injuries and deaths. Men typically gather on Sunday mornings, hoping the judge on that day will pick their bird as the best singer. The birds are displayed in these hand-carved cages. They're very lacquered, and they're actually, a lot of them are quite beautiful. While the focus on the contest is social, there's often a little bit of illegal gambling happening. I developed a source within Operation Ornery Birds who granted me behind-the-scenes access to follow the investigation over the span of 2 years as multiple traffickers were brought to justice. More than 500 birds were rescued from illegal traders, and once they were seized, they were brought to this warehouse in Miami where a forensic ornithologist checked their condition and identified each one of them. The birds received clean cages and care in hopes that they would eventually be able to be released. Most of the ornery birds, including these two grosbeaks, were in fact released into the wild in Everglades National Park. For me, that story about the illegal songbird trade highlighted how wildlife trafficking targets even the smallest creatures with sometimes devastating consequences for biodiversity. Similarly, the trade of glass eels, juvenile eels, exploits another vulnerable species to meet global market demands. Wild glass eels are smuggled in massive quantities to Asia, where they're raised and shipped all over the world to be served as unagi at sushi restaurants. Who eats unagi? Nobody? Come on. It's pretty tasty. It is. When I started to write freelance stories for National Geographic about 8 years ago, my first story was about the illegal eel trade. Maine has the only legal commercial viable eel fishery. The problem was Fish and Wildlife authorities had found evidence that criminals were laundering eels captured in one place where it was illegal through the legal fishery in Maine. And this is really common. You see this in a lot of things, especially with the pet trade, where you have a legal industry and there's always a couple bad actors who are looking to exploit it. The American eel is one of 16 species in the eel family, and they are arguably some of the most mysterious creatures in nature. Every year, the sexually mature eels leave rivers draining into the Atlantic Ocean, and they swim all the way to the Sargasso Sea to spawn. There's something inside these eels that drives them to go there. Nobody really knows a whole lot about them. Nobody's ever witnessed them spawning. When they finish spawning, the adults die. And then these eel larvae, at the time when they first start to drift away, they look like little transparent willow leaves. And they drift north, scattering all along the coastlines from Venezuela to Greenland. As they go, they start developing, and by the time they reach the coastline, they resemble little eels, those glass eels that I showed you, where you can see pretty much entirely through them, just these little beady eyes. They kind of look like Thai noodles when they're all stuck together. And Maine fishermen use these fyke nets to catch the eels as they're swimming upstream. And they distribute all through the rivers. And we have them here in New York and the Hudson River. You find them in some of the tributaries. But Maine is really the place where they have an eel fishery. In the past, these American eels represented a small fraction of the international sales. They were less desirable to Asian tastes than now endangered Japanese and European eels. But bans on fishing those endangered eels have jolted a U.S. industry. Asia needs eels to help seed their giant aquaculture farms, and our American eels have helped. The baby eels are shipped overseas and distributed to the aquaculture farms, and within a year, when they reach about a foot long, they're gutted, they're harvested, gutted, deboned, butterflied, split down the back, cut into square fillets, skewered, dipped in soy sauce, and grilled right at the facility. And then they vacuum pack them, and they send them all over the world as unagi, served at sushi restaurants. even here in the United States, possibly down the block. It used to be legal to catch eels anywhere along the U.S. East Coast. By the 1990s, they were growing scarce. See what I mean about how they resemble noodles? Most states responded to concerns about overexploitation by banning eel fishing. Maine implemented a quota system. Prices in 2012 skyrocketed to $2,000 a pound for glass eels. That created what became known as an eel rush in Maine. Guys who'd scrape by in the off-season were doing construction jobs, painting houses, collecting seaweed and worms, were suddenly making hundreds of thousands of dollars in eels. One fisherman told me that in 2012, he made $150,000 and he paid off his house. The next year, he made $200,000 and he bought his son a house. Authorities started tightening restrictions to prevent eels from disappearing in Maine, too. And meanwhile, the feds mounted a multi-state undercover investigation to catch eel launderers. This is Bill Sheldon, the grandfather of Maine's eel fishery and the kingpin of the biggest domestic wildlife smuggling operation ever to hit the eastern seaboard. He's sitting here at his Quonset hut in Ellsworth, Maine. And as a result of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's Operation Broken Glass, you can tell they like to come up with creative names, Sheldon pleaded guilty to trafficking more than $500,000 in eels. He was heavily fined and he went to prison for a year. More than 20 other men pleaded guilty for participating in what was altogether a $5 million trafficking scheme. When I interviewed Sheldon, I asked if he eats sushi. There was like a sushi bar just around the corner. And he said, I'm not really a fan. He didn't like unagi. And then he turned and he pinched a bunch of eels and he ate them right in front of me. And then he dared me to do it, promising me that it would bring longevity and wisdom. He'd been a really good sport, allowing me to interview him for a number of days. So I reluctantly accepted his dare and I gulped one live eel. And I could feel it wiggling in my throat as I swallowed. In the course of my career covering wildlife stories, I've traveled to 6 continents for a wide variety of magazines. I've written 15 investigative stories about wildlife crime and animal exploitation for National Geographic. There is no shortage of subjects. Currently, the world's markets for illegal wildlife products and exotic pets are located on social media platforms like Facebook, Instagram, and Snapchat. In just a few clicks, you can buy anything. You can find pages and groups and postings selling lions and tigers, birds, snakes, monkeys, and insects for the exotic pet trade. You can also find endangered wildlife products such as elephant ivory, rhino horn, and pangolin scales, and marine turtle shells. Using encrypted messaging apps, sellers and buyers anywhere can connect in ways like never before. These things also make it easy to investigate online, I have to admit. People always ask me about my favorite stories. It's really hard to choose, so instead I'd like to tell you about a couple of the most surprising ones. When I heard about a strange trade in dead hummingbirds used as love charms, I started Googling to see if I could find someone selling them. I discovered a woman on YouTube teaching viewers how to use dead hummingbirds to, and I quote, trap a man and dominate him so he'll always come back. She was like this wicked Martha Stewart on YouTube. She offered step-by-step instructions. The ingredients were photographs of 2 would-be lovers, a piece of paper with their names written on it 3 times, a small glass jar, and a dried dead hummingbird. She rolled the bird inside the photographs, wrapped it in pink yarn, and shrouded it in fly paper. Then she dipped it in cinnamon spice, squeezed it into the jar, and spritzed it with perfumes and oils. Pheromones, she said, to make sure he would be sexually attracted and stay sexually attracted. And then she filled the jar with honey and topped it off with rose petals. You could make your own honey jar following her instructions, or you could buy a ready-made one for $500, which would be a felony under this country's wildlife laws. The legal trade of hummingbirds for chaparosa charms, as they're known, is a growing problem. The underground market for hummingbirds was so secretive, the U.S. government didn't even know it existed until they intercepted a package and found dozens of lifeless little jewel-like colored birds. They began an undercover operation to catch the hummingbird traffickers who were selling the birds at markets for only $45 a piece. Chaparosas are often sold wrapped in red paper and satin tassels like these, with an accompanying prayer, "Divine hummingbird, with your holy power, I ask that you enrich my life and love so that my lover will want only me." No one knows what the toll of the emerging hummingbird trade might be making on these birds. They're already imperiled by habitat loss and climate change. As global temperatures rise, the flowering periods of nectar plants for hummingbirds are shifting earlier into the season, becoming increasingly out of sync with the birds' foraging demands. Hummingbirds may look tiny and dainty, but they're actually very feisty. If they feel threatened, they'll chase you or your pets, and they're tough enough to flourish in some of the harshest environments. You can find them in the heights of the Andes and the lowlands of Central America, in the arid Southwest, and the chilly coastlines of Alaska. At least 17 species of hummingbirds migrate between the U.S. and Mexico, where a small group of researchers spend several days each month at a field site in Mexico City, monitoring both winter hummingbird guests and year-round residents. They capture the birds with mist nets, examine them, and fit them with leg bands, and then the scientists use those leg bands to track their migrations over time. Some of these birds make epic journeys, traveling thousands of miles between their wintering and nesting grounds. In order to see if hummingbirds were being sold in Mexico's Sonora market, known as the witchcraft market, I enlisted a santero named Cristobal, who practices the Yoruba religion. You see him here at his family's shrine. Yoruba is an African faith now commonly followed in Cuba, the Caribbean, Latin America, and some parts of the U.S. I learned that in Yoruba beliefs, the hummingbird is an important messenger between the spiritual and physical realms. Hummingbirds, unlike pigeons and chickens, aren't used in sacrificial ceremonies. They're revered. At the market there were shops filled with dream catchers and voodoo dolls, candles, animal skulls, and Santa Muerte statues. And there were dead hummingbirds dangling in some places from the ceilings or from little hooks at the vendors' counters. One of the vendors told me how she does the love charms. She said she puts two birds face to face, and ideally wrapped in the underwear from both a woman and a man. Then she puts them in a small red bag and fills it with pure honey and places it in a shrine with candles. Retired U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service forensic scientist Pepper Trail spent years trying to better understand the chaparosa trade and looking for clues to catch the criminals. While I was visiting him at the agency's forensic lab in Ashland, Oregon, he solved the mystery of how some of the birds were being killed. Using an X-ray machine, he determined that at least a third of the ones that had been seized were riddled with lead shot. Someone was killing hummingbirds with a shotgun. Recent investigations by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service have uncovered shipments of hundreds of hummingbird specimens, with arrests in states like Texas and New Mexico. Over a 7-year period, agents confiscated over 900 specimens across 20 species. These arrests aim to curb the demand and raise awareness about the ecological and legal implications of this trade. The exploitation of wildlife for human benefit takes many forms, but the underlying motive is always the same: profit. The problem of bee thieving also falls into the category of stories that surprised me. Cattle raiding and horse thieving were common crimes in the Wild West, but bee rustling is a relatively new offense to the law books. That's thanks in large part to the increasing necessity of profitability of trucking billions of bees to vast almond orchards in the Central Valley of California. These orchards are in dire need of pollination. And there's also a thriving international market for gourmet honey that has perpetuated the trade. It's the perfect crime, Butte County Police Detective Rowdy J. Freeman told me. You see a person in a white suit, and it looks like a beekeeper, but it could be a thief too. You just never know. Steve Godlin is one of the commercial beekeepers in the Central Valley who had hundreds of hives stolen by bee thieves. Factoring the value of the equipment, the bees, and lost pollination fees, a stolen hive is worth about $350. Oftentimes, thieves steal hundreds in one night, wiping out a beekeeper's annual income. California almond season is the pollination Grand Prix. This is what the orchards look like in peak season. They're really beautiful. In roughly 4 weeks between February and March, when almond buds burst into pink and white petals, billions of honeybees buzz through the orchards, collecting pollen and nectar for their hives and simultaneously pollinating about 1 million acres of almonds. Almond farmers generally rent 2 hives per acre to ensure adequate pollination. The fees average around $200. And when the almond bloom ends, they truck their bees to other areas to pollinate other crops. More than 90 crops, actually, from apples and avocados to blueberries and cherries. In the days leading up to the almond bloom, an estimated 85% of the honeybees in the country are trucked into Central Valley. The budget hotels, Denny's, and IHOPs overflow with rugged out-of-towners, sweaty and dirty from working day and night with their bees. A commercial beekeeper makes a modest and very sticky living, traveling to the country, pollinating dozens of different crops. But it's the almonds that pay their kids' college loans and their mortgages. In addition to trying to keep pace with increasing almond acreage, beekeepers are struggling to prevent their colonies from succumbing to a multitude of threats. Mites, viruses, bacteria, funguses, pesticides, often all of these things simultaneously. Many beekeepers say that there has never been a time when it has been so hard to keep bees. The opportunity for such high profits is motive for theft. But here's the thing, not just anybody can steal millions of stinging bees. More often than not, bee burglars are beekeepers. The biggest hive heists in California history began around 2017, when there was an unusually high number of bee crimes reported throughout the Central Valley. 200, 300, 400 hives at a time in many different locations. Detectives knew it had to be someone in the business. A few weeks after the almond bloom, they investigated a report about a suspicious discovery, a vacant lot on the outskirts of Fresno, with bee boxes in all types of shapes and colors and designs, stacked and scattered everywhere. At the scene, they found what appeared to be a chop shop, like chopping cars, where boxes were being sanded, repainted, and stenciled with the name Allstate Apiaries, Inc., a business operated by this man who was on the site tending the bees. Officers arrested the 51-year-old Ukrainian immigrant and later an alleged accomplice. As the investigation progressed, the detectives uncovered similar operations in 2 other locations. Ultimately, they recovered 2,500 hives worth $875,000. The theft of bees during California's almond season highlights the intersection between human economic pressures and the exploitation of natural resources. The truth is, human activity and wildlife survival needs often come at the expense of each other. Often, wildlife survival often comes at the expense of human needs. You can see this in Africa, where the bushmeat crisis threatens biodiversity and ecosystems. It's the same underlying challenge, balancing human needs with conserving wildlife. 20-some years ago, when I first started writing stories about wildlife and conservation, there were a lot of stories about the bushmeat trade. But then I didn't hear much about this issue for quite a long time. So I proposed to National Geographic magazine that we do a fresh article on the subject. And it just so happened that one of their star photographers, Brent Sturton, was already documenting the problem on multiple continents. The story led me to the Republic of Congo in Africa, where the growing demand for wild meat as luxury food is emptying forests and risking the spread of deadly diseases. Subsistence hunters have long relied on the forest for food, such as these monkeys shot legally near a village called Kabu in northern Congo. Cabo. It's important to know that subsistence hunting is not the major problem emptying these forests. It's commercial scale hunting to supply luxury meat to large urban centers like Brazzaville and Kinshasa and further afield. This is a vendor at a market in the town of Weso, lowering a whole monkey into a customer's bag. Domestic sources of meat, such as chicken and pork, are very limited in Weso. But some townspeople here are participating in a program to raise chickens locally, reducing the demand for bushmeat. Here, a Wildlife Conservation Society fieldworker is collecting information about animals, such as these duikers shot in a logging concession where regulated hunting is permitted. Long-term monitoring helps provide an indication of the forest biodiversity and whether subsistence hunting is sustainable. Bushmeat hunting for this type of commercial trade in large cities is absolutely not sustainable. These women are selling a variety of meats, including dwarf crocodile, antelope, monkey, and bush pig at a popular night market in Brazzaville. I learned that they sometimes sell endangered elephants and pangolins under the table. Studies show that bushmeat consumption threatens more than 300 species of terrestrial mammals with extinction. Wild meat can be found in major European and US cities. In a single year, UK's border force seized more than 2,200 pounds of wild meat, including chimp and giraffe, from travelers entering the country. The unregulated trade increases human exposure to dangerous viruses, amplifying the risk of a disease outbreak. This man could be patient zero in the next pandemic. He's preparing a fresh bat for the customer at the market in Brazzaville. He took it live from the cage and smacked it to death on the concrete. And then he deboned it with his teeth for his client. As you can see, wildlife trade creates close contact between animals and between humans and wild animals, increasing the risk of pathogens like coronaviruses, avian influenza, monkeypox, and Ebola jumping from animals to humans and spreading globally. 3/4 of all emerging infectious diseases are zoonotic. In a recent study, researchers tested more than 3,500 bats, rodents, and primates in the Congo Basin for coronavirus, and they found signs of the virus in 121 animals. All but 2 of them were bats. Monkeypox, also called Mpox, is a serious health threat in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where it has been endemic for decades. It's actually transmitted they believe, by rodents, not monkeys. And this young woman with her daughter is suffering from monkeypox. They're spending time in a hospital isolation ward. Her older daughter had recently died from the disease. Fortunately, there are people like Chef Honor Tudisa, who is offering an alternative to bushmeat in his restaurant. He's part of a novel campaign to protect wildlife from poaching and other environmental threats. The campaign doesn't focus on what not to eat. It's based on positive messaging. It celebrates the region's gastronomy. There are billboards and TV ads and YouTube cooking demonstrations promoting wild meat-free Congolese cuisine as yokopimbo, delicious. He uses fresh produce, locally raised meat, and insects purchased at the local market. One common ingredient is palm weevil larvae, a popular protein alternative to meat in parts of Africa. Some people have grown up with these larvae, and so there isn't the stigma that there is here about eating non-meat items like bugs. At Chudisa's restaurant, I ate a dish featuring crickets, this is the dish actually, and grubs sauteed in fresh mangoes, and these mangoes have been gathered from the trees in his garden. I found the grubs were kind of shrimp-like in texture, and thankfully they weren't alive and wiggling. A byproduct of the bushmeat trade is a supply of baby animals for the illegal pet trade. Baby chimps like this one are often orphaned when their mothers are killed for bushmeat. If they aren't lucky enough to be rescued and cared for by a rehabilitation center, the chimps are sold to brokers who in turn market them to international buyers willing to pay up to hundreds of thousands of dollars or tens of thousands of dollars for an exotic animal as a pet. But animals trafficked for the pet trade face extreme stress, inadequate and often non-existent care during transport, and poor living conditions, leading to mortality as high as 90%. The international trade of wild cheetahs has been banned for nearly 50 years. Still, more than 3,600 live cheetah cubs were for sale or sold illegally worldwide in the span of only 10 years. Somaliland is believed to be the center of the trade because it's easy access to animals in Ethiopia and Kenya, 500 miles of coastline, and close proximity to Yemen. About 10% of trafficked cheetah cubs are intercepted by law enforcement. Rescued cubs like this one are often sick and suffering in grueling conditions with very little nutrition. Many don't survive. But here's some happy news. Global law enforcement agencies are intensifying their efforts to combat illegal wildlife trade. One high-profile success is Operation Thunder, a recurring global initiative by Interpol and the World Customs Organization. In 2023, Operation Thunder led to 2,114 seizures and 500 arrests across 133 countries. Confiscated items included 660 pounds of ivory, rhinoceros horns, big cat body parts, shark fins and jaws like this one, and thousands of animals like primates and birds. Authorities also recovered 86,000 pounds of timber and disrupted numerous transnational organized crime networks. We're not only in the midst of a biodiversity crisis, we're encountering a crisis in journalism too. Environmental investigative reporters are becoming almost as endangered as the wildlife and wild places we cover. In 2024 alone, there have been major media layoffs across the country, including at the LA Times, Time Magazine, NBC, Forbes, National Geographic, Business Insider, and Sports Illustrated. This trend toward media layoffs and closings has been going on for quite some time, actually. Since the 1980s, newspaper employment has declined by more than 60%. National Geographic's readership has gone from the peak of 12 million in the late 1980s to 1.7 million today. In 2023, Disney, the current owner of the iconic magazine, announced that it would no longer be sold on newsstands. All of the publication's staff writers and many of the longtime editors have been laid off. From 2015 to late 2023, the National Geographic Society funded an investigative journalism program called Wildlife Watch, publishing the stories I and many others wrote about wildlife, crime, and animal exploitation for the magazine and for its website. When Disney canceled the project at the end of last year, I and two former National Geographic editors got together and formed Wildlife Investigative Reporters and Editors, WIRE. We felt that this coverage was too important, to fade away. We wanted to see it continue. Our mission is producing compelling investigative journalism to galvanize change and inspire a more compassionate, environmentally responsible society. As you know well, there has never been a more critical time for journalism. Misinformation is everywhere. Plummeting revenue and slash budgets have eroded newsrooms. Clickbait is dominating. With Wire, we aim to produce 6 deep, documentary, film-worthy investigative journalism projects in our first 3 years, and we're just getting started. They will be published with mainstream media partners. Our first big project, having to do with commercial wildlife poaching in Africa's Congo Basin, is slated to be published with Rolling Stone in 2025, and there's a film in development too. Other topics we're gearing up to cover include destruction of the Amazon rainforest, illegal fishing, and deep-sea mining. Our journalistic focus is organized crime, animal-borne diseases, animal trade, online wildlife trafficking, industry corruption, and climate change. In these challenging times for biodiversity and journalism, I hope you'll be an advocate for protecting them both. If you'd like to learn more about my organization or support our work or send us a story tip, you can scan this barcode or go to our website, which is wireonline.org. Thank you again for having me tonight. It has been such a treat.
We have time for a few questions for Rene, if anyone has any.
Hi. So I was a journalism undergrad, and because of all the layoffs and stuff, I had to pivot my whole career. So I have so much respect for you and for people that stay in the profession. My question is, I feel like now people's attention spans are lower. They're looking at TikToks, they're looking at Instagram. Is there any thoughts in your head about ways to pivot your journalism to be able to reach a broader audience of people with the lower amounts of time that they're looking at things?
That's a really good question, and I'm sorry you haven't stuck with journalism because we need good journalists, we really do. And you are in a very big club of people who have decided the market is just too difficult right now. And it's honestly part of what's driving us to start a new organization too. And new organizations, some of them succeed, some of them don't, some of them combine with other organizations. We have no idea where our path will take us, but we're going to try to do something good. In terms of reaching a broader audience, I feel like, I don't know, I think people will always read good stories. Our stories read like crime stories. Who doesn't love to read a good crime story with a great villain? So I think that, a lot of these stories, they are long and they will still be read. We're also working with documentary filmmakers, and I feel like films really have a lot of potential to change people's attitudes and behaviors in the span of only an hour or two. Something you see on a streaming network can really impact you and spur you to do something differently. But I hear you about TikTok and some of the other platforms, and I do agree we need to be there too. That's obviously how a lot of people are getting their news, and it's not my expertise. I definitely have not been very active on TikTok, but as we get going along with our organization, we'll probably be bringing in some people who can do that sort of thing.
Hey, thank you so much for this talk. It was very interesting.
Thank you.
Curiosity about, I guess, maybe curbing this illegal trade. Obviously, regulation and enforcement play a significant role. I guess, in particular, with traditional medicines, do you know if anything is being done to sort of either curb demand or maybe educate as to the potential costs of some of the illegal aspects of the supply?
Yeah, so much. There's so much on the demand side of these problems. Like we often hear about, the supply side, the rhino horns and the pangolin scales, but we don't talk a whole lot about the demand side of it. There are cultural traditions, but also, people just taking advantage of a tradition and selling things on Amazon and, sometimes it's not even legitimate. Sometimes they're just like selling false products, but still perpetuating that idea that these products made from nature are somehow, have mystical qualities. Honestly, there isn't enough focus on demand.
Hi. In the same vein, do you know what's driving the demand for bushmeat? Because is it like a cultural tradition? Because, I don't know, I'll barely eat undercooked chicken. So if I were to know something that potentially could have an entirely new disease, I think I'd steer clear. So I'm wondering, what is driving demand?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because in many parts of Africa, people don't trust, conventional sources of protein because they've gotten sick from eating chicken or beef that is sold in the grocery store that was, past its due date. They trust what they know, and oftentimes that's what was cooked at home. And, that's, if they live near the forest, that's, what's familiar. So as I said, subsistence hunting is not the problem. If it was only subsistence hunting, we wouldn't be dealing with so much extinction. But the big problem is this luxury demand. So bushmeat being trafficked into large cities. And remember, it's traveling over large areas, so oftentimes they have to smoke it in order for it to not completely spoil by the time it gets to its destination. And in that case, it's really a lot of times, people really kind of wanting a taste from home, something that was familiar, and they live in an urban place and they're willing to pay more for it. But there are campaigns to get the message out that, this isn't really the best source of protein. It's not necessarily safe. And, there are other things that are available, for instance, locally raised meats that, you could buy from the market that would be a better choice.
So I have, it's two parts. One is an observation, which is that as journalists, our responsibility, especially with investigative reporting like this, is to encourage people to switch on their brains and read beyond 100 letters. And if it's compelling enough, and so much of this is, and if it's marketed so that you reach the masses and you sort of infiltrate social media and encourage people beyond that, it will broaden the knowledge and therefore the interest. My actual question is, where are you getting your funding? How are you supporting your .org, and what are you doing going forward to raise funds?
Yeah, thank you. I agree with your observation, and it's a good question. So our initial funding has come from Rewild, which is Leonardo DiCaprio's organization, and they've provided a fiscal sponsorship to our organization to help incubate us as a nonprofit. We're talking to a lot of the major foundations, Bloomberg Philanthropies, we're currently in discussions with, the Waite Foundation, Morgan Fund. We are working on getting a meeting with the Emerson Collective. A lot of the main, every organization is talking pretty much to the same list of large foundations, and we have some private donations. So again, we're just getting started. Everybody loves the idea of funding a project. So finding that institutional unrestricted funding we're finding is a little bit challenging, and we're a group of journalists doing this for the first time, but we're out there doing it, and so far we've been hearing a lot of excitement for what we're doing.
Hi, thank you for this talk. It's been really enlightening, and I just wanted to ask, I guess, about the criminals that you are investigating, and I guess this is more of just like in your experience, have you seen the criminals have they been more opportunistic? Has it been more career criminals? Is it a smattering of both? Is it basically just like, are people doing this because of the market forces in general? Are they doing it for personal gain? I guess could you shed more light onto why people are doing these crimes?
Sure. I mean, there are a couple different types of criminals, right? So you've got the poachers at sort of the very bottom level. And, quite honestly, they're looking for resources that can be profitable. And that could be fish, it could be live animals, it could be bushmeat, anything that's available. And, you know, these guys, I don't really think of them as criminals because they're really just trying to make a living, and they're facing the reality that they have to feed their families. In Africa, it's really, really important to many people to send their kids to school. And so they're often making sacrifices in order to make sure their kids can attend a good school. The real criminals, honestly, are the ones that are sort of like in the middle or just at the export point. And those are the guys who are making a lot more money. And they're exploiting the little guys. They sell these things, you know, on the international market for 10 times what they're paying to the little guy. So that's really the place to look for the criminals, I think. And in terms of like what motivates them, it's all about profit. Money makes the world go round.
Thank you so much for this very enlightening talk. So you were talking a lot about sort of charismatic megafauna and other sort of sympathetic animals or insects like bees, hummingbirds. In your reporting, have you come across illegal wildlife trades focusing on the sort of less sympathetic animals or insects or even plants? And have you found a different response when you publish stories about those?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Yeah, so like I said, there's a trade in just about everything. They've confiscated about 6,000 species, you know, cactuses, orchids, bromeliads, all kinds of plants, ants, spiders, beetles, just anything you can pretty much think of. And I mean, in terms of the response, I think some of those are surprising. And I think, again, I think people love to read a good crime story. I think it is obviously harder to get like sympathy from the public for, you know, protecting those species. But, you know, they're certainly being trafficked, and there are certainly good stories about interesting characters, charismatic criminals who are out there doing it.
Have there been any dangers to the journalists themselves? Like, have you, for example, ever thought, I may not make it out of here safely?
We really try to do everything we can to stay safe. And so on my last trip to Africa, I contracted a security specialist who helped us look at every possible scenario that could happen while we were there, because the DRC is notorious for not being a particularly safe place to travel for anyone, and as a journalist, maybe even more so. So we work with security specialists. We hire fixers who are from the locations. We work with scientists who are in the locations, who have been there for dozens of years and, you know, really know what they're doing, and have the context that it might take in the event of an incident. And we let the authorities know that we're going to be in the area too. So, you know, just posting or sending a note on the government's website to say, I'm going to be traveling in this country, in case there is an evacuation, you're already on the list. You go to the embassy, they look down the list and they say, okay, you're on this list, come on into the embassy. There's like some very basic steps that you can take, and everyone should actually do that to make sure that if something happens, you are recognized as an American citizen and you can find refuge. But, you know, yeah, there have been times when it felt a little dicey, but we really do everything we can to avoid that, and we carry insurance too.
I went to the fashion exhibit at the Metropolitan Museum a few months ago, and apparently in the 30s it was quite the thing to have kill birds as fashion accessories. Did you see that, or it was?
Yeah, that's actually what inspired the Audubon Society. Yes. Yeah, because
thousands of birds were killed because it was a fashion item.
Yeah, hundreds of thousands of birds at the turn of the century were killed for ladies' hats and dresses, and it was all the rage. And then, you know, it was actually a group of women in Boston who got together and said, enough's enough. You know, we don't want to see all these birds slaughtered. And they started talking and advocating, and eventually the first Audubon Society was formed, and eventually it led to the Migratory Bird Treaty Act.
Maybe one or two more.
Hey, thank you so much. Really, really fascinating. My question is, obviously, you know, you're looking into a variety of criminals who are breaking the law. Are there any practices, I mean, this is a very large question, but are there some like practices going on today that you very much think should be illegal in the same vein as these that aren't necessarily criminal and can't be investigated in the same kind of way? Or maybe can be, but it's bear a different kind of scrutiny?
Yeah, as I mentioned, there's almost always some bad actors hiding within a legal industry. You know, so I think there needs to be tightened restrictions on a lot of especially the pet industry, and a lot more scrutiny into what's being moved around. I think in some cases maybe there needs to be bans on certain animals until there can be like legitimate regulated trade, or maybe a particular species shouldn't be traded at all. And that's not really for me to decide or for me to editorialize on. As a journalist, my job is to report the facts and to go in and, you know, produce a lens for citizens like you to learn about the issues, and then lobby your lawmakers and, you know, ask for change to make sure that the wrongs are righted. But, you know, I think that, like I said, anywhere where you have a legal trade, should be keeping an eye out for those bad actors who are exploiting it, taking advantage. Yes, Brian.
Thank you. Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, thank you so much for the talk. It was extremely fascinating. I just had a question about maybe I won't say the opposite of tightening restrictions, but have there been any sort of initiative to work with hunters or people within the industry to like work on laws together instead of just tightening restrictions from the outside? So people might be a little bit more likely to adhere to such restrictions if they were involved in creating them.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of initiatives working with people on the ground, individual poachers, groups of poachers, and actually, you know, trying to be a part of the solution or providing alternative incomes, which is another really important thing. You know, if a person who's collecting, you know, illegal monkeys because that's how they can make a living has an alternative to that, then, you know, that might become a much better option for both them and for wildlife. So there are a lot of groups working on these sorts of things, and I wish I could talk about them all, but you know, I would encourage you to research the groups that are doing these things.
Next question.
Sorry, I'm just answering this gentleman's question about crimes that are going under the radar.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just back from Zimbabwe doing the big game count. And we counted about 20,000 elephants. Not one big trophy elephant was counted. All gone to trophy hunters. No big lions. No leopards. All to trophy hunters. And these have been shot legally there. But if you bring a leopard skin over here in your suitcase, you'll be arrested. But a trophy hunter can shoot a leopard and bring it back here. I'm not talking about general trophy hunting of the plains game. I'm talking about the big cats, giraffe and elephant. None left. They've gone. Elephants have been born with no tusk now because the gene pool is gone. So why is this not being attacked? Because there's a lot of officials in Africa being bribed by the hunting industry, and the money going into deep pockets, not back into wildlife conservation.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of corruption. Thank you for sharing that experience.
Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And thank you so much, Renee, for this inspiring and illuminating event.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Really eye-opening. Thank you.
Thank
and
you.
You can go to explorers.org for more Monday night lectures.
Thank you. Thank you.